The evening light fell like a thin blanket over the suffocating air of a forgotten land. Beneath the rusted tin roof of a dilapidated shack, where even the wind seemed tired, lay a creature curled up in the shadows and dust. Emaciated, flaking, and almost unrecognizable as the being once honored, it barely clung to life. Max, a Malinois once trained to lead mine detection missions, who had thrown himself into gunfire to save his comrades, was now chained with a rusted iron collar, wrapped around his neck like the shackles of betrayal. The metal bit into his flesh, crusted with dry blood, rust, and sores, leaving behind swollen red welts. His once glossy coat, once praised as a natural armor, had become a patchy, mangy mess, revealing cracked, ulcerated skin marred with old scars. Each breath was a silent battle. His chest rose and fell as if even the air here was too scarce to breathe. There were no more commands, no more familiar footsteps echoing each morning, no hand to stroke his fur, no warm voice calling his name through dreams filled with sand and explosions. The world Max once belonged to, the world of duty, of teammates, of unconditional loyalty, had long since disappeared. Now, he was just a forgotten creature in a dark corner. No one asked what he had done, who he had saved, how many wounds he had taken for someone else. No one looked into his weary eyes to see the soul that remained, a soul that never abandoned the one he loved. But Max never forgot. Even as his vision faded, his hearing dulled, and hunger spun his head in dizzy spells, he still remembered her. The only person who ever called his name not as an order, but as if calling a friend. Sarah. She hadn't been young when Max first met her. Her frame was small, her shoulders sloping forward as if carrying the weight of a lifetime. Deep lines marked her forehead, not from age, but from what she had witnessed. Fallen friends, lost comrades, hope dissolving into dust. Yet in her eyes, there was always something strange, an unwavering gentleness, as if no matter how the world fell apart, she would still choose to walk forward and hold on to what little remained. Sarah was a commanding officer, not the type who shouted and punished. She was quiet, observant, and acted only when necessary. She had walked into the training camp, stopped in front of Max's cage, and told the manager that she didn't want a perfect dog. She wanted one whose eyes still held hope. And they chose each other, silently, like a nod between two weathered souls. Max never left her side on missions. He saved her when their armored vehicle overturned from a roadside bomb. He leaped in front of her when enemies charged from behind. He tore the arm of a man who threatened her during a night raid. And she had once cradled him in a field tent after he was shot, placed his head on her lap, and whispered in a trembling voice, "Don't leave me, Max." But in the end, she was the one forced to leave. Sarah was discharged after a spinal injury. The reassignment order came without warning, and she wasn't allowed to keep Max. They took him away one cold morning without letting her say goodbye. She had struggled, begged, but the military didn't hear the sobs of an older woman clinging to the collar of the dog she trusted more than any comrade. Max was taken, and the look in his eyes as he turned back was the deepest cut in her memory. And Max. He never understood why Sarah didn't come back. No one explained. No one called him Max anymore. Only commands. Eat, lie down, punishment. Every gesture of affection disappeared, as if it had never existed. He couldn't understand why his heart had been thrown into such darkness, or why the one he loved most was no longer beside him. So he waited, not from hope, but from the instinct of a warrior. A warrior never leaves his post until the last commander returns. And today, something strange drifted on the wind. A scent, ancient, painfully familiar, crept into the haze between life and death. Max twitched. His ears, long deaf to the world, trembled slightly. A gasp, a faint shiver. No one saw it, no one knew. But deep within that seemingly empty heart, something stirred. Someone was coming. And Max, though rotting in body, still waited. Because if it was Sarah, then he had never truly left. At first it was just a faint sound, soft, gentle, like wind sweeping across old concrete. But in a world where every sound meant survival, Max knew the difference. The lazy shuffles of the camp caretaker, the heavy boots that passed without ever looking in, the clatter of metal bowls, the screech of steel doors slamming shut. Max had learned them all, but this sound was different. It wasn't loud, it wasn't rushed, it wasn't heavy. It had rhythm, soul, and a hesitant grace, as if each step carried something unnamed. Max didn't exactly hear it with his ears. His ears were nearly numb after years of silence. He felt it through the calloused pads of feet that had marched through fire and sand, through a heartbeat that had memorized waiting and the ache of disappointment. That sound seeped into him like a trickle of water, slipping through the cracks of a barren soul, not noisy, not urgent, but relentless. He lifted his head, or rather, tried to. The chained neck burned like fire, the skin cracked and bleeding around the iron. But Max still tried. His cloudy eyes, long unable to see clearly, focused on the figure appearing at the end of the corridor. Just a silhouette framed by the door's light. But he knew. He knew the moment her breath changed. Max couldn't remember the last time he felt her presence. Maybe in a dream. Maybe the day they dragged him away. Or maybe one morning among sand and gunfire, when she'd patted his head and said, "Good boy, Max." But even though memory had gathered dust, his heart recognized her, because it had never been forgotten. Her, Sarah. Though her steps were slower, her hair now streaked with silver, her gloved hands trembling slightly, Max still knew that walk. Still recognized the deliberate calm in her gait, the way her shoes touched the floor. Gentle, not aggressive like the guards, but careful, like someone walking into memory. Sarah approached slowly, each step a passage through the maze of years apart. The light from behind her stretched her shadow across the dusty floor, like a crack running back through time, reaching toward Max. At that moment, Max heard nothing else. No buzzing flies, no clanking chains, only the beat of his heart. Then she spoke, softly, as if a louder sound might shatter the fragile miracle before her. "Max?" That voice, hoarse and weaker than before, still pierced through the fog clouding his mind. Max shuddered. He tried to rise, his front legs shaking, his whole body straining as if lifting a boulder off his chest. He didn't bark, he couldn't. But his tail, the tail that had long since drooped under chains, now twitched, a slight wag, like a soul exhaling after years of waiting, finally certain that what it had held on to was real. Sarah knelt. Her eyes welled with tears. Her hand trembled as it reached out, hovering near Max's snout as if awaiting a miracle. And he answered, not with strength, but with presence, with the life that never left, with a dry, cracked nose pressing gently into her palm, the same palm that had cradled him when he was wounded, that had stroked his ears every night after missions. The whole room held its breath. There was no war, no betrayal, no pain. Only two survivors, one woman, one dog, find each other again among the ashes of time. And Max, though broken, though no longer the warrior he once was, nudged his head into her chest, as if to say, "I'm still here. I've still been waiting for you, Sarah." The rusted door creaked open with a cold, grating sound, flooding the dark kennel with a blinding light. It was a pale, dry light, casting itself over the floating dust in the air like a fine rain of powder. Max squeezed his eyes shut on instinct. The light was no longer salvation, but a blade. After so many years imprisoned in darkness, his eyes had learned to live without seeing. His understanding of the world now came through his ears, nose, skin, and something he had never lost: memory. The sound of the door wasn't loud, but to Max it was a heartbeat breaking the monotony of a symphony that had lasted too long. He no longer reacted to the door. It had opened and closed many times, bringing in people whose eyes always looked away, or worse, looked at him with disdain. But today was different. Not quite the sound, not quite the light. It was the silence afterward. A lingering silence, waiting, unhurried, gentle. A silence that held presence. Max couldn't make out the figure in front of him. His eyes were cloudy like fogged glass, tears welling at the corners from the sudden light, and a flood of unnameable emotions. The figure stood still, and though their body was backlit, their stance, their breath, the way the space seemed to bend around them, it was all chillingly familiar. Then, from within that dense, suffocating space, a voice spoke. Not a shout, not an empty call, just one word. Sits. Max jolted as if someone had flipped a switch that sent electricity flooding a long, dormant circuit inside him. Sits. German for sit, a basic command he'd learned as a pup. But when spoken by others, it had always been meaningless. It lacked attachment. It belonged to no one. It was just a sound. But now, coming from that voice, hoarse, slow, aged, Max knew. He knew. It was her. Sarah. Though her voice was drier now, slower, weaker, the rhythm was unmistakable. It was the breath that had guided him through ambushes, the voice that had comforted him when wounded, the whisper he'd heard when pulled from a ring of fire and bullets. "I'm here." Max trembled, his body shaking uncontrollably, not from fear, not from pain, but from the overwhelming wave of memory crashing through a shore long dried and cracked. A part of him he thought had died suddenly came back to life. He struggled to lift his head, even as his neck screamed in agony under the chain, as if a blade pressed to his skin. His front legs quivered and bent. What should have been a simple motion was now a war. His muscles, wasted and weak, barely responded. But the instincts of a soldier flared again, because this was a command from his true commander. He folded his legs, his back curving slightly, and slowly lowered himself. The posture was no longer proud, steady, but it was still sits, complete and loyal, as if never forgotten. Sarah stood silently, eyes red, her hand clutching the kennel door until her knuckles turned white. She hadn't expected him to remember, hadn't expected him to respond, hadn't dared to believe that amid all the pain, abandonment, chains, and neglect, Max had held on to one thing, the memory of her. Max looked up at her. For the first time in years, his eyes shimmered with a glint of light. Not light reflected from outside, but light from within, from a part of his soul that had never gone cold. His gaze was equal parts doubtful and trusting, overwhelmed and cautious. He exhaled, a long, strained breath, as if letting go of a century's worth of confinement. She stepped closer, slowly, kneeling before him. Her aging knees shook as they touched the cold cement floor. She extended her hand, not to touch, just to offer, palm open, facing him, just like that first day they met at the training camp. Back then, Max had been small and scared. Now he wasn't scared, just unsure it could be real. But instinct doesn't lie. The eyes don't lie. The scent. It was Sarah. Max leaned forward, his steps unsteady, and rested his head gently into her hand, like a leaf falling into a quiet lake. Sarah cried without sound. Only tears fell on Max's head, warm, salty, and aching, like the first rain on parched land. She couldn't believe he still remembered her. But Max hadn't forgotten. For humans, memory may fade. But for an animal who once loved with its whole being, every trace becomes a carving in stone. He remembered her. He still trusted her. And all it took was one word, one call, to awaken the essence of who he was beneath the dust of time. Sits. Max sat there, in the arms of his old commander. No barking, no whining, just silence, like a warrior who had finally found the sun after an endless night. When Max laid his head in Sarah's hand, something shattered inside him. As if the door to his memories had burst open, no longer sealed behind invisible barriers. They poured out, wave after wave, like a flood returning after years of drought. He didn't know whether he was dreaming or truly awake, but the images were crystal clear, down to the breath. Max remembered being a small pup in the military training camp. In the beginning, he was just a tiny frame, with soft fur, ears perked in confusion amidst shouts, whistles, and the thick smell of sweat in the scorching wind. No one cuddled him. No one called his name with gentleness. He was commanded, rewarded with a clicker, and given dry jerky instead of affection. Max learned quickly, not out of fear, but because he wanted to be chosen. Among the hundreds of dogs behind the training fences, he wanted someone to look at him and say, "I'll go with this one." And then she came. She wasn't like the young soldiers who laughed and played with the dogs during breaks. She walked slowly, her frame slender but shoulders squared, a weathered face not hardened by coldness. While others picked strong, energetic dogs, Sarah stopped in front of Max, the dog who stood apart, quiet, with eyes that saw too much. She didn't say much, just knelt, extended her hand, and whispered something Max would remember forever. "I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to be loyal." From that moment, Max was transferred to her unit. Training with Sarah wasn't easy. She was firm, but never harsh. She taught him through her gaze, her patience, and the belief that he understood more than others gave him credit for. He learned to sniff out explosives, react to sounds, and stay motionless for hours, waiting for the slightest signal. But the most important thing Sarah taught wasn't in any manual. It was camaraderie. When they were deployed to Afghanistan, everything changed. No more grassy fields to train, no more whistles, only dust, blistering heat, and quiet fields hide death. Max remembered his first mission. His heart pounded so hard it nearly choked him. He couldn't take his eyes off Sarah, even when ordered to spread out. But she always looked back, always whispered, "Don't be afraid. I'm here." Like each word was a lifeline, keeping him from slipping into panic. Then came the day no one would forget. A routine patrol, or so it seemed. Max led as usual. His nose caught something faint, unusual. He stopped and growled low. A warning. The unit halted. Sarah signaled to spread out, but before they could react, a blast tore through the air from the right, a shockwave throwing everything into chaos. Max rushed toward her through choking dust, ears ringing, shrapnel slicing the air, and in that moment, when he saw a shadow charging toward her with a raised weapon, Max didn't hesitate. He leapt. His whole body became a living arrow. The attacker didn't even have time to pull the trigger. Max tackled him from behind, sinking his teeth into the man's wrist. A gunshot rang out, not from the attacker, from behind Max. He heard Sarah's scream. Then pain. A searing burn tore across his side, like fire, like molten steel, like a bullet he couldn't dodge. Max staggered. The world spun, but he still stood between Sarah and danger, even as his hind legs gave way and blood soaked his fur. He was wounded, but Sarah lived, and that was all that mattered. The days after were spent in a field hospital. Sarah stayed by his cot, never leaving. Max burned with fever, delirious, once nearly dying from biting the IV line. But she never scolded. She just held his head in her lap and cried. She kissed his forehead, for the first time, and whispered, "You're my hero." Max survived. But from that point on, there was something between them that couldn't be named. A bond beyond command or duty. A connection forged on the edge of life and death. A trust that needed no explanation. He served 2 more years by her side. Every time they deployed, Sarah would bend down and say, "Going with me?" And Max always answered by touching her hand with his nose. No words needed. He had chosen, and he never left that choice behind. That memory, buried beneath years of fear and abandonment, now surged in Max's eyes as he watched Sarah kneeling before him, her hand still outstretched, her heart still waiting. No words were needed, because everything that needed to be said had already been lived. But beautiful memories don't last forever. Even in war, where loyalty is held equal to life, there are still those who see nothing but control and profit. Max remembered clearly the day Victor Shaw arrived. Officer Shaw was the kind of man whose very footsteps changed the air, not from authority, but from coldness. His face was always stern, emotionless, a sharp nose, a square jaw, and eyes the color of steel that never once blinked for life or loss. In him, there was no compassion, only procedure, only efficiency, only orders. Max had been trained to read human movement, an instinct he carried deep. He could sense who was a friend, who shouldn't be approached. And with Shaw, that instinct screamed. From their first meeting, Max's ears perked up. His body leaned slightly back, eyes wary, not from fear, but from a lack of trust. Shaw didn't love dogs. He didn't want friendship, nor did he believe in bonds. In his cold and lifeless reports, dogs were biological sensory units, expendable assets, no different from a rifle or a radio. To Shaw, Max was just another tool in animal form, something to be replaced if broken. Sarah saw it from the beginning. She knew that numbers and charts couldn't replace emotion, that survival on the battlefield came not just from skill, but from understanding, between humans and dogs. She had spoken out when Shaw assigned exhausted canines to high-risk missions and had filed reports protesting overtraining sessions that left 2 dogs collapsed on the field. But Shaw did not forgive resistance. The breaking point came on a dusty morning just after Max returned from a mission, his old wounds still bleeding. Sarah knelt to bandage him, her hands trembling as she whispered, "As long as you're still breathing, I won't let anyone push you back into hell." Shaw approached, voice flat and cold. "No one needs a wounded dog on the front line." Then he ordered Max to be reassessed, an elegant way of stripping Sarah of her authority. She refused. For the first time, Sarah stood straight before him, under the flickering fluorescent lights of a stifling conference room, and spoke with a strength no one expected from a woman carrying a back injury. "Max isn't a device, he's a teammate." Shaw didn't reply. He just looked at her, eyes like dull knives, not sharp, but still capable of shredding trust. The next day, Sarah received emergency transfer orders back home for post-injury health concerns. Everything happened so fast she didn't even get to see Max one last time. And Max, not knowing what had happened, simply knew that morning the person he trusted didn't come to his cage. No scent, no footsteps, no gentle eyes greeted him. He barked, howled, ran in frantic circles. But Sarah never returned. Not because she abandoned him, but because someone had decided that a loyal soldier was a threat to a heartless system. From then on, Max was transferred to another unit. No one called his name with trust anymore. No more gentle strokes after missions. Only orders, harsh, curtain, cold. Missions dragged on with no regard for safety. No one cared if he was wounded. If he didn't return, another dog would take his place. And every night, in a steel cage inside a field camp, Max would rest his head on his paws, eyes wide open, listening in vain for the old footsteps, the sound of Sarah. But it never came. Only wind, only the gnawing emptiness. Max never forgot the look in Sarah's eyes as she was pulled from the unit, her eyes red, her hand reaching out as if trying to hold on to something. He had let out one final howl, a call even he didn't understand, except that it was all he had left to make her stay. But between war and command, there is no room for the howl of a dog. Only the coldness of someone like Victor Shaw, a man in uniform, who issued orders to comrades, but never learned that loyalty does not come from command. It comes from humanity. After the day Sarah vanished as if erased from the world, Max was pulled from his combat unit and relocated to a place they called by a clinical name, Re-Standardization Training Facility. But in truth, it wasn't a training center. It was a place to break him. The truck carrying Max drove for an entire day. No one spoke to him. No one touched him except for the chain wrapped around his neck, dragging him along like cargo. The faces around him showed no eyes, only weary numbness like people long used to move things that still breathed, but were no longer considered alive. When the truck stopped, Max was shoved into a small compound with high fences and low roofs, where dogs barked endlessly but no life stirred. No one called his name. They simply stuck a number on his collar. The name Max, 2 syllables once spoken through dry voices in desert storms, was replaced with a lifeless code. That's where it all began. In the first days, Max tried to stay sane. He didn't know why he was there, nor why Sarah hadn't come. But he clung to her image, this woman who had knelt to meet his eyes, who reached out instead of raising a taser, who once said softly, "I need you, Max." And he told himself, if I stay alive, she'll come back. But then the brutal years began. The retraining camp didn't teach him anything new. It taught him to forget everything that had once made him believe in humans. Max was starved for 3 days straight. No clean water, no light, just a tiny kennel under 2 square meters, cold floor, rusted iron walls, and a stench of waste that never left. When they brought him out, it wasn't for walks, but for punishment. They used electric prods to test reflexes. They left blinding lights on all night, then cut them suddenly so he couldn't sleep. They slammed on his cage whenever he closed his eyes, to shatter any illusion of safety. The men in armor, with mirrored sunglasses, never looked him in the eye, as if they feared seeing something that would stop their hand. Every time Max reacted on instinct, growling, flinching, or collapsing in hopelessness, they recorded it in their log. Behavior not yet rehabilitated. And then they continued. Electric shocks, isolation in darkness, food hung just out of reach. There were days he couldn't lift himself. Days when giving up felt like the only possible relief. But the one thing that kept him alive was memory. The memory of Sarah. Quiet, steady, like a hidden stream beneath the desert. He remembered the way she called his name, the scent of her hand when it rested on his forehead, the soft sigh in the middle of the night after the battle. We're still alive. Tomorrow we go again. Max couldn't explain why a creature drained of hope still remembered such small things. But that's how memory works. It holds on to what was given with love. And Max, even at his lowest, was still a creature shaped by love. On one of the rare occasions he was taken out for a new command test, Max stood still as an unfamiliar soldier barked, "Sits!" No reaction. "Sits!" Louder this time, taser lifted in threat. Max still didn't move. Not because he didn't remember the command, but because that voice wasn't one he trusted. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't a true order. He didn't respond to hollow commands, only to the voice engraved into his bones. The soldier punished him with a jolt of electricity. Max collapsed, limbs jerking, heart racing out of rhythm. But his eyes didn't show obedience. They showed the remnants of a torn soul still guarding what was left of his loyalty. Eventually, they gave up on him. He wasn't aggressive enough to be used in attack. He wasn't obedient enough to serve as a training tool. Max was labeled no longer operational. After that, he was moved from one facility to another, each worse than the last. The conditions grew harsher. The rules are stricter. The treatment is colder. Each place had its differences, but one thing remained the same. No one called his name. No one asked where he came from. No one cared why there was a scar on his back. No one knew this was the dog who had once pulled a soldier from a ring of fire. To them, Max was a failure. But Max, though worn down to the edge, never forgot. He still turned his head toward the door every time someone passed by, hoping to see a familiar limp, a quiet gaze, a voice cutting through the coarse, empty noise. Max! Just once more. One last time. To hear that name from the right person. And one day, that light, the real light, finally came. But before it touched Max's life, he had endured the most brutal of years. Years where every breath was a quiet triumph. No one saw it, no one knew. But beneath the mangy fur and wasted body, the heart of a warrior still beat, unbroken, because someone out there still remembered who he had been. The years passed like a dark, frigid river, washing away the youth and strength of a once proud warrior. Max had grown used to silence, to living among shadows and cold metal bars slicing across his view. The fierce, full-bodied barks of his younger days had long since faded. Only weak, labored breaths remained in the dark. Max's world had shrunk to a narrow corner of a damp concrete cage, the rusted walls etched into the cracks beneath his claws. But the one thing he had never forgotten, never let go, was the image of Sarah, the woman who had fought beside him in fire and death. Each day, as dim sunlight slipped through the cracks in the kennel's roof, Max would lift his head and tilt his nose forward, as if searching for something familiar. A gentle scent, a distant sound, an old voice, just fragments of memory he fought to hold on to. But the days rolled on, and that tiny hope wore down with every disappointment. No one came. No one searched for him. The world had seemingly forgotten the brave and loyal dog he once was. But today, something felt different. Max sensed a shift in the air, a subtle change in the rhythm of footsteps echoing down the hallway. These steps weren't heavy and cold like the guards, nor hurried and indifferent like the trainers who had passed through his life. They were slow, cautious, and carried something intangible, like a distant memory returning on a breeze of summer in the middle of a long, frozen winter. The corridor door creaked open. The sound of rusted metal groaned softly as light spilled in, forcing Max to squint, his pupils trembling from a brightness he hadn't seen in so long. A figure entered, aged, silver hair glistening under the light, walking with a limp, shoulders worn from time and war. The woman stood before rows of cages, her eyes scanning slowly, eyes weighed down by pain and loss, yet still seeking. She moved from cage to cage, pausing briefly with each dog. No one knew what she was looking for. But Max curled in the farthest, darkest corner of his cage and felt something miraculous approaching. His heart began to race, his breath trembling. He slowly tried to lift his head, throat tightening, ears, normally pinned flat, quivering slightly. Even with blurred vision dulled by years, he strained to see the figure drawing closer to his cage. Then she stopped, right in front of him. Their eyes met through rusted steel, and time seemed to freeze in that instant. Sarah didn't recognize Max. How could she? The proud warrior she once knew was now nothing but skin and bones, mangy fur barely clinging to a skeletal frame, eyes clouded and haunted. She stood frozen, her heart skipping a beat, tears brimming as she gazed at the withered dog in the shadows. Something deeply familiar tugged at her soul, but still too distant to name. But Max knew instantly. How could he forget that scent, that steady yet gentle gaze, that voice that once called his name through the chaos of war? Max didn't need to think. He didn't hesitate. At that moment, even as his body failed him, even though he couldn't stand, even though he couldn't move a step forward, he lifted his weary, clouded eyes and looked straight at Sarah. His eyes said everything, stronger than any bark could. He didn't need to walk, didn't need to move. He simply lay there, eyes quivering with something raw, the waiting, the hope, the reason he had survived all those brutal years. Sarah stepped closer, kneeling before the cage. Her trembling hands touched the icy steel bars, and from her lips came a whisper, cracked with emotion. "Max, is it you?" No answer. Only his eyes, still locked on her, so deep and intent it felt like she could see the memories flooding back. The same gaze he had given her in battle, the same gaze when he was wounded, the same gaze from dreams of long ago. She reached through the narrow gap, stretching as far as she could to touch him, and Max, with the last strength in his tired body, gently placed his head into her palm feeling the warmth he thought he'd never feel again. In that moment, all the pain, all the loneliness, all the years of suffering dissolved into a single, tender touch, deeper than anything words could express. Tears rolled down Sarah's aged face. She whispered through the sob in her throat, "I'm so sorry, Max, I came too late." But Max's eyes held no blame. Only one thing burned in them, one message he had carried in silence for so long. "I waited for you. I knew you'd come." Sarah didn't need confirmation. She knew this was her Max, her bravest, most loyal friend, the dog who had once saved her life in battle, the one she had searched for endlessly and in vain for all these years. No words were needed, nothing more, because they had found each other again. That look, that silence, that connection said it all. And Max, for the first time in so many years, closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of a familiar hand, and drifted into sleep, peaceful, pain-free, certain now that she would never leave him again. Sarah carried Max from the cage without a word. No accusations, no anger. She didn't need to ask who had done this to him. The only thing that mattered now was that he was still breathing, and he still recognized her. The years of torment hadn't killed the most sacred thing between them, a bond that needed no words, no conditions. Her car stopped in front of a small veterinary clinic on the outskirts of town. A quiet place she trusted. Inside, everything was tidy. The faint scent of antiseptic lingered in the air. Not harsh like the detention camps, but soft, like an unspoken reassurance. Max was placed on the exam table, not by a leash dragging his neck, but wrapped in a soft blanket. Despite his ravaged body, he didn't panic. No struggling, no growling. Because in Sarah's eyes, he knew. This time, the hands touching him were to heal, not to hurt. Dr. Olivia, a woman in her 40s with tied-back hair and sharp yet kind eyes, approached, her gaze fixed on Max. She didn't ask much. She just looked. And as if with one gentle touch of her fingers along his side, Olivia understood. This wasn't just an injured animal. This was a warrior who had survived on loyalty and endurance. "You can speak freely," Olivia said, turning to Sarah, her voice low. "But I won't lie. This case is severe." Sarah nodded without needing to hear more. She stood beside the table, her thin hand holding Max's leg. Just a small gesture, but a lifeline tethering them to everything they had lost and still held on to. Olivia leaned in to begin. Max's neck was swollen. Around the deep scars, tufts of fur had fallen away, revealing red, ulcerated skin, some parts already infected. Clear signs of a metal collar worn too long, too tight. When Olivia touched him, Max only shuddered. No growl, no fight. He stayed still, eyes half closed, as if he knew. This time the pain came with hope, not punishment. She opened his mouth gently, frowning at the bruised gums and chipped, broken teeth. He had chewed something hard, maybe bars, maybe chains, in desperation. Under the thin fur were countless scars, each one holding a story no one had ever listened to. But the worst was his back leg. His right hip was completely dislocated, once broken, and never set. The way Max lay tilted to one side wasn't habit. It was the only posture that didn't knock him out from pain. She placed a stethoscope on his chest. His heart beat, slow but steady. His lungs, damaged but not dangerously so. Olivia glanced at Sarah, as if wanting to say something, but simply exhaled a long, quiet breath. "He's endured more than any animal I've ever seen," Olivia whispered, softly enough only Sarah could hear. "But the miracle is, he still lets us touch him. He still trusts." Sarah bowed her head and kissed the top of Max's head, where dusty fur still clung. She didn't cry. Her tears had long run dry. All that remained was breathless gratitude, that he was still alive, that the look in his eyes was still the same as before, that no pain, no horror had made him forget the person who once called his name with love. Olivia cleaned the wounds, gave antibiotics, painkillers, and fluids. Max stayed calm the whole time. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he knew he was being saved. In one quiet moment, as sunlight angled through the clinic window, glinting off dirty fur and blood-stained bandages, Olivia froze. She had never believed in souls in animals, but when she looked into Max's half-lidded eyes, shining quietly like the depths of a lake, she knew. This was a soul that had walked through hell and still chose to believe in people. Finally, Max was laid gently on a soft mattress in the recovery room. Sarah sat beside him, silently stroking his thin back. Each time her fingers traced a scar or brushed a wound, she felt a piece of history, not of war, but of silence, waiting, and the wordless endurance of a love that never dies. And when Max let out a soft sigh, resting his head on Sarah's knee, closing his eyes, peaceful, for the first time in years, she knew he had found a place where the pain could finally end. That night, while Max slept, his breath slow and light like a child's, Sarah remained by his side, sleepless. She couldn't close her eyes. The emotions inside her were too vast to be contained by tears. Leaning back in her chair, her hand gently stroked Max's thinning fur, pausing now and then on a scar, as if she, too, could still feel the lingering pain beneath his skin. Olivia had gone home. The clinic was quiet, filled only with the soft ticking of the IV drip, and the wind slipping through a gap in the door. In that dim light, the small lamp cast a soft glow over the blanket, illuminating Max's half-closed eyes and Sarah's weathered face. That image, at that precise moment, made her realize that some wounds cannot stay hidden in darkness. Some pains must be seen to be healed, and there are truths that, if left unspoken, will be forgotten, just like Max had once been forgotten. Sarah stood slowly and took out her phone. She leaned down and took a photo. No framing, no filters, just a simple image. Max curled up, his hind legs tucked into his belly like a reflex of defense, his body frail and almost blending into the old gray blanket. But his eyes, those eyes, were open slightly, turned toward her, silent, clear, and without blame. She stared at the photo for a long time. Then she opened her social media app, a place she once used only to check the weather or share pictures from her garden. She placed her finger on the caption box and hesitated for a moment. There was no need for long stories. No need to explain the war, the years of torment, or the distance she had traveled to find him again. Just one sentence. A quiet, sorrowful whisper meant for a country that once honored its warriors, then forgot them in silence. He once fought for this country, and this is how we've treated him. Sarah pressed post. Then she set the phone down and returned to sit beside Max, not thinking about movements or causes, only the simple truth. Her friend was still alive, and he deserved to live with dignity. The next morning, as the first light filtered through the window, Sarah's phone lit up over and over again. Notifications, messages, calls, comments. The photo spread like wildfire, not because Sarah was famous, but because of Max's eyes that didn't need words, yet stirred even hearts that had long gone numb from endless sad news. The photo was shared by veterans, animal lovers, and welfare groups, and soon the press picked it up. Under every post were thousands of comments, some angry, some heartbroken, many apologetic, as if a whole nation suddenly realized that behind every uniform, not only people returned in silence, but so did four-legged souls who had once sacrificed without a voice. The media reached out to Sarah. They wanted to know about Max, who he had been, what he had done, why he had been abandoned. But Sarah didn't answer everything. She brought only the photo, pointed to the scar on his neck, and said, "It doesn't matter how many medals he had. A dog who once saved a life, left to rot like this, is all it takes to know something is deeply wrong." Within 2 days, Max's photo appeared on the front pages of major newspapers. Animal welfare organizations launched a campaign called Still Breathing, Still Remembered to investigate the fate of forgotten K9s after retirement. Politicians began raising the issue in Parliament. Petitions were filed demanding government funding for retired military dogs. The country woke up, not from a speech, but from a gaze. And Max, still lying quietly in the small clinic room, head resting on Sarah's knee, knew nothing of the storm rising outside. He didn't need to. For him, the greatest change wasn't happening on social media or in policy meetings. It was in the hand gently stroking his back, in the way Sarah looked at him, in the air now free of rust and electric burn, replaced by dry grass, sunlight, and love. For Max, only one thing mattered. The dream he had waited for all these years was no longer just a dream. Within just 3 days of the photo being posted, Max, the dog once buried in the forgotten corner of a crumbling training camp, had become a name seen everywhere, from the phones of everyday citizens to the primetime broadcasts on national television. Strangely, no one knew exactly where Max had served or which unit he had belonged to. His military records were unclear or missing. All the world had was a photo. A dog curled up on an old blanket, with eyes tired yet still glowing with warmth toward the woman beside him. And it was those eyes that sparked an unprecedented wave, a storm of outrage, sorrow, and awakening across the country. On the news, the usual reports on politics and economics paused for a long breath when the image appeared on screen. One anchor, after reading the caption, bowed his head in silence before moving on to the next segment. On social media, a short clip went viral, Max being held by Sarah in the clinic. Each of his labored breaths, the faint wag of his tail when she spoke, became a powerful emotional trigger, bringing hundreds of thousands to tears. "We hand out medals to humans, but dogs, we let them die in silence?" wrote a veteran journalist on his page. "Max isn't just a dog, he's a symbol of betrayal," commented a former soldier who had lost comrades to an IED, yet remembered vividly the K9 that detected the final mine and saved his unit. Animal rights organizations responded swiftly. The National Military Animal Welfare Council opened an urgent case, demanding a formal investigation into how K9s were classified, retired, and treated post-service. They posted Max's photo with bold text. "Max is one, but how many others are being forgotten?" Veteran groups, from large cities to small rural towns, spoke out. Men who once wore uniforms, who had slept in the cold with rifles in their arms and dogs by their sides, dug out faded photos of them and their dogs. Under each photo were words that hit hard. "I survived because of him. No animal deserves to be abandoned." The outrage reached Congress. Some previously silent politicians now faced questions. Where had the combat dog support budget gone? How many animals had been treated like disposable gear? Who was accountable? And amid the storm, people began digging through records, searching for names involved in mishandling K9 service animals. The name Victor Shaw, once Sarah's commanding officer, resurfaced. No one said his name directly on air, but whispers grew louder. Who ordered Max's transfer? Who signed off on isolating dogs that didn't comply? Who called them biological sensor devices? Shaw remained silent. But that silence only fueled the public's fury. Under every related post, hundreds of thousands of comments demanded accountability, not just for Max, but for every loyal life forgotten, discarded like the invisible ghosts of war. And in the middle of it all, Max still lay quietly on the mattress in Sarah's home, as if unaware he was now the center of a nationwide firestorm. He breathed steadily and opened his eyes each time Sarah approached. And if he had the strength, his tail moved, slowly, faintly, just enough to say he still recognized her. Sarah said little. She turned off most notifications, declined interviews, and ignored a flood of talk show invitations. For her, the spotlight didn't matter. The arguments didn't matter. What mattered was whether Max could eat a little, whether he kept his medicine down, whether each morning, when he opened his eyes, he still saw her face in the sunlight. The media storm might shake policy, might expose truths once buried, but in a quiet house on the edge of town, there was another current, quieter, deeper, the slow resurrection of a body once broken, the healing of a soul, not needing applause or cameras, and Max, frail, scarred, carrying wounds yet to close, was alive, no longer a discarded tool, but a soul remembered by name, by love, by memory, and by the awakening of a nation. Amid the whirlwind outside, where the world curled itself in the storm of public outrage, in Sarah's quiet little home, where gentle sunlight touched old wooden window frames and the scent of chamomile tea floated through the kitchen, Max was coming back to life in the gentlest way possible. Not through media calls or viral hashtags, but through the kind of small moments most would overlook. A home-cooked meal on time, a soft cloth dabbing his feverish fur, and a little girl with a crooked braid and eyes bright as spring sunshine. Her name was Emma. Emma was the neighbor's child, only 8 years old. And yet, from the very first time she saw Max, she showed no fear. She didn't pull her hand back. She didn't ask why he looked strange, why he didn't play like other dogs, or why his fur was patchy like a worn-out quilt. She simply walked up, sat beside him, holding an old stuffed bear named Milo, and gently said, "It's cloudy today, Max, but that's okay. We still have each other." Sarah almost intervened, wanted to warn her that Max was still in pain, still easily startled, that it was better to keep a safe distance. But Max didn't growl. He didn't retreat to the corner like he usually did when strangers came near. He just opened his eyes and looked at Emma for a long time, not with full trust, but with no fear either. And when Emma quietly placed Milo beside Max's blanket, like two forgotten beings sharing a warm corner, Sarah knew something was beginning to change. The next day, Emma returned. Same yellow bee-print slippers, same dress with ink stains at the hem, still clutching Milo, and a picture book about forest animals. She sat down, opened the book, and read to Max in her soft, expressive voice. The fox hid in its den, but the rabbit wasn't afraid, because it knew the fox was just sad. Max didn't react. He simply lay still, blinking slowly. But Sarah noticed. Every time Emma paused, even just to turn the page, Max tilted his ears as if trying to hold on to the thread of the story. Day after day, Emma became a part of Max's world. She never asked Sarah, "Why is he sad?" or "Can he talk?" because she didn't need to know. Children have a way of understanding wounds without needing to name them. Emma was simply there, like a tiny flame, not strong enough to burn away the darkness, but just enough to warm the coldest, quietest corners of Max's heart. Then one afternoon, with soft drizzle misting the porch, Emma sat beside Max as usual and shared that she got a bad grade in math that day. But her mom said it was okay as long as she kept trying. She hesitated, glanced around, and whispered, "I get scared too, like Max. I get scared when the teacher calls my name. But today I was brave and recited the multiplication table." Then she leaned forward, resting her cheek gently against Max's back, the closest she could reach through the blanket. A quiet, careful touch, like someone gently pressing their hand to a memory. No warning, no growl. Max didn't move away. He lay still. And then, so faintly it could have been the wind, his tail gave a single soft wag. Sarah, washing dishes in the kitchen, froze. She turned, breath held. Emma had no idea what she'd just done. To her, it was just a hug, just something she did with Milo every night before bed. But to Max, it was the first time in years he had allowed someone who wasn't Sarah, to touch him. Not for treatment, not for restraint, but for something simple and pure. Closeness, no conditions, no demands. Max's eyes said little. He simply watched the small hand stroking the rough fur at his side, a gaze that seemed to ask, "Why didn't that touch hurt?" Then slowly, his eyes drifted closed. Not from exhaustion, but because he wanted that feeling to last just a little longer. From that day on, Emma came every afternoon. Sometimes with bone-shaped cookies she molded herself, sometimes with a crayon drawing of Max and Milo beneath a rainbow, and always with a soft greeting. "Hi, Max, did you feel brave today?" And Max, somehow, always answered, sometimes with a glance, sometimes with a gentle nose nudge, and sometimes with a slow tail wag, a whisper of trust returning. Sarah knew. No medicine, no media, not even herself, had done what Emma had. Emma was the missing piece Max needed to begin truly living again. No one teaches a child how to heal a shattered soul. But sometimes, innocence is the perfect healer, because it doesn't try to fix. It simply shows up and loves, without question. And for Max, the dog once deemed useless, that meant everything. That day, the sky was a solemn shade of gray, as if even the heavens were holding back emotion. Sarah's house was unchanged, simple, warm, still filled with the soft scent of herbal tea near the old armchair where she read or knitted as Max lay nearby. But something about the air felt different. A strange quiet, not from the absence of sound, but from the tension of something just about to happen. Max lay there, as always, on the clean mattress with a hand-stitched blanket layered on top. His fur had begun to grow back in sparse patches. The skin beneath was no longer raw, just lined with faded scars. One, in particular, ran across his left side, a ghost of the bullet wound he'd survived on that fateful battlefield. That morning he'd eaten a little rice porridge, even tilted his head when Sarah called his name. But for weeks now, he hadn't stood. Even trying to press his legs to the floor made him tremble as if he might snap in half. Sarah never rushed him. She understood. After years of being broken in body and spirit, standing up wasn't just a mechanical act. It was a war within. He had to believe that if he moved, he wouldn't be struck, wouldn't be dragged back by a metal chain, wouldn't be starved as punishment. He had to trust that the person next to him wouldn't turn away, that there was light after so many years of dark. And then, without warning, Max stirred. Sarah was in the kitchen when she heard the soft scrape of nails on wood. Not frantic, not loud, but tentative, as if someone was checking if they were allowed to exist. She turned, slowly walking toward the living room, where Max had always stayed. But now, his head was lifted higher than usual, his eyes wide and shining with something different. Not the quiet weight of before, but determination. A glow that only appears when someone chooses to step out of a prison built from their past. Max braced himself, drawing strength into his trembling legs. One front paw touched the floor, slow, shaky, but determined. Sarah approached, bending slightly to help, but stopped. Max glanced up, not pleading, not afraid, but as if to say, "Let me do this." He set down the second paw, then pushed himself upright, hind legs buckling, knees quivering. His whole body trembled, frail enough to collapse at any moment. But he held. His breath came sharp, and his chest heaved like it might burst. Then came the first step. A front paw lifted. Placed ahead, slightly off balance, but it held. The back leg dragged slightly behind, every muscle spasmed with the reflex of remembered pain, but Max pressed forward. A second step. Then a third. Sarah stood frozen. She didn't dare breathe. Her eyes filled, but she held the tears back. She knew. Right now, Max didn't need pity. He needed recognition. He was walking, not just on 4 trembling legs, but on the strength of his memories. Each step pushed back against invisible chains. Each movement defied the trauma of past beatings, the flash of tasers, and the echo of slammed iron doors. Proving this time could be different. He reached the center of the room, barely 3 meters, then stopped. His back arched, sweat soaked his fur, breath rasping like it was being torn from a wounded throat. But his eyes stayed fixed on Sarah, and that gaze made her fall to the floor. "Max," she said. Just his name. Her voice broke into a sob, and then she opened her arms. Max moved forward, slowly. Each step is like crossing a border between two worlds, the forgotten and the beloved. And when he reached her arms, when his legs buckled but didn't collapse, when he buried his head in her lap and shook like a child, finally finding home, Sarah wrapped him in an embrace, holding tight as if part of her own body had returned from the edge of the world. She didn't speak. The tears just came, falling onto his fur, soaking into the hardened scars on his neck. One hand rested on Max's chest, where his heart thudded, uneven and raw, but alive. Max had stood, had walked, not as a rescued dog, but as a soldier who had finally crossed the cruelest battlefield, the one inside his memory. Since the day Max stood on his own again, Sarah's small house felt changed, not by anything grand, but in the quietest ways. The soft thump of his tail in the morning when she came downstairs, the light scratching of his paws on the carpet as he moved from corner to corner, the gentler look in his eyes whenever Emma rested her hand on his head. It was as if Max was slowly returning to life, not rushed, not loud, like a wound healing silently from within. Then came the night the storm arrived. Without warning, the wind began in the afternoon. Heavy gray clouds swallowed the sky. When the first thunder cracked across the torn heavens, Sarah stood by the window, watching the branches whip wildly in the wind, and pulled her light coat tighter around her chest. She knew this storm wouldn't pass easily. The suburbs were fragile to flash floods and falling trees, and that old shed on the hill, long abandoned, probably wouldn't survive the night. She was just about to shut the door when Max, lying at her feet, suddenly sprang up. It wasn't the thunder. It wasn't the wind. It was something much softer, a faint whimper, nearly drowned in the rustling leaves and pelting rain. But Max had heard it. He braced himself and stepped quickly towards the door. Sarah sensed something in him. Alert, not afraid, like a forgotten instinct had stirred awake. "Max!" she called. But he didn't turn. He just looked into her eyes for a moment, eyes that seemed to whisper, "Do you trust me?" And Sarah understood. She threw on a raincoat, grabbed a flashlight, and followed him. The wind slapped her face, whipping her silver hair. Max didn't run fast, but steady. Each step sparked a memory, a rhythm like all those times he'd charged ahead through smoke and chaos, leading the team, finding safety. He moved over the slope behind the house, past rain-soaked trees, toward the old wooden shed nestled beneath the pine ridge, forgotten by time. The shed door hung off its hinges, part of the roof caved in, rotting beams split and cracked. But Max didn't pause. He circled to the back, the old side entrance, and stopped. Another whimper, faint, fragile. Sarah shone the light where Max was pointing, and then she saw it. Beneath a fallen sheet of tin, soaked and caked with mud, a tiny creature curled into itself, trembling in the cold water, eyes wide with terror. A puppy, so thin its ribs stuck out, one hind leg swollen, dried blood crusted around the joint. Max lunged forward, without command, without signal. Not because of training, not out of habit, but something purer. The empathy of a soul who once lay at rock bottom, now seeing himself in those shaking eyes. He squeezed into the gap, nudging the metal sheet aside with his snout, bit by bit. Sarah cried out for him, afraid the collapsing wood might fall. But Max didn't stop. He wriggled in next to the pup and curled himself around it, shielding it from the cold and wind. The way Max used his head to gently push the little dog out, so careful, so tender, left Sarah frozen in place, breathless. At last they emerged from the wreckage. Sarah wrapped the pup in a towel, trembling as she held it close, while Max collapsed beside her, soaked, exhausted but eyes still open, still watching over that tiny life as if to say, "You won't be forgotten, not like I was." By morning light, Dr. Olivia came to examine the pup. It had survived. Emaciated, severely malnourished, a broken hind leg, but no internal damage. The neighbor girl Emma rushed over when she heard, and named her Dusty, after her dusty brown-gray fur, muddied like a long road. Max watched from a respectful distance, never pushing forward, never demanding attention. But when Dusty whimpered in pain, he came closer, lay down beside her, and touched his nose gently to her ear. A soft gesture, like a tiny flame being passed. Sarah sat watching the two dogs lying side by side, one large, one small, two warriors, two survivors. And she knew that healing isn't just about getting back up after pain. Healing is when you can shelter someone smaller than yourself. And Max, after everything, chose to save. Not out of duty, but from the heart. From that stormy night on, everything began to shift in ways no one expected. The image of Max, scarred and battered, curled under a sheet of rusted tin to shield a helpless life, spread quietly across social media like silent lightning. But it wasn't the kind of viral storm that raged and faded. This time it struck deeper. A quiet question etched into people's minds. How many other Maxes are out there, locked away, unseen, unknown? Sarah had never liked attention, but she understood that silence now was complicity. She accepted an offer from a group of volunteers with Voices Unheard, an organization dedicated to finding and rescuing abandoned or mistreated canine dogs after military service. And Max, with eyes that had seen what most refused to believe, became the key to a truth long buried. The mission began humbly. One pickup truck, 3 volunteers, and a map of the western states, areas that once housed temporary training sites before combat dogs, were reassigned or discarded. Sarah went along, sitting beside Max in the back seat, her hand always resting on his back like a lifeline between two worlds, the hidden past and the present being rewritten. Max wasn't like other guide dogs. He didn't bark or thrash or dig for signs. He was quiet. But when they passed a rundown compound at the edge of a forest, barely marked on the map as CS-H72, Max suddenly bolted upright, ears perked, body tense, then a low whine. Not of pain, but like the exhale of a soul brushing against a buried memory. "Stop the car," Sarah said without hesitation. The nameless warehouse was covered in moss, its yard wrapped in rusted barbed wire. Inside, the air was thick, dog waste, dried blood, time, and forgetting. Max moved without pause, straight to a trapdoor in the back corner, easily missed. He scratched once, then twice, his nails tapping wood like a knock on the gates of a forgotten hell. They opened it. Below was a dark pit. Flashlights scanned rusty cages, and in them hollow eyes stared back, not barking, not howling, just silent, drained, like souls unsure if they were still alive. 7 dogs, all former K9s, tattooed ID numbers on ears, and chain scars around necks, one with a broken leg still healing, one blind in one eye, one is just skin and bones. But when they saw Max, all of them strained toward him, not barking, not growling, just a primal recognition, a fellow survivor of the darkness they still carried. From there, the rescues continued. Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, places long erased from official maps, hidden under labels like obsolete biological storage. Max's memory led them. At each abandoned site, his reaction changed. Sometimes still, sometimes a soft whine, sometimes a single bark, as if to say, "Here, someone was left behind." And one by one, the doors opened. Dogs who had once been heroes, now nameless, undocumented, were brought into the light and given back the only title they ever earned: comrade. In the tattered files, one name surfaced again and again: Victor Shaw. During the war, he headed the Tactical Optimization for K-9 Units program, shut down for ethical violations. After the war, while generals retired, Shaw quietly moved into private military training. He ran a covert network that disposed of unfit dogs, locked away, deleted from records, treated like bio-waste. But now, the truth was no longer buried. Max, the dog once left behind, had become the guide for other forgotten souls. Each rescue placed Max in the role of pathfinder. And he did it, not for orders, but from a heart once torn apart. Because now Max knew that healing doesn't end with yourself. It begins when you help others find the light where you once saw only darkness. Not long after the wave of rescues stirred the public, Victor Shaw, the man who once held life and death power in clandestine facilities, was officially brought to trial. On the morning the court session began, a pale gray sky draped a thin layer of mist over the stone steps of the county courthouse, a place that, for years, had only seen humans come and go, debating right and wrong. But today, a witness arrived without words. No testimony, no defense, no dramatic speech. He walked on four legs, slow, steady, and quiet, just like the way he had survived the most brutal years of his life. Max, the once forgotten warrior dog. The soft leather collar around his neck was worn with age. A simple metal tag swayed gently. Max, K-9 retired. But it wasn't the tag that made the corridor fall silent as he passed. It was his eyes. Eyes no one could etch in metal. Eyes that carried a truth so deep it didn't need to be spoken. Sarah walked beside him. An old veteran, her silver hair tied back, her gaze no longer stern but calm and kind. Her hand rested lightly on Max's back, not to guide, but to remind them both that they had climbed out of the deepest abyss together. And today, they would walk into the place where dignity, never meant to be lost, would be reclaimed. Inside the courtroom, every seat was taken. Members of the press, former soldiers, even students are invited to learn that war doesn't only scar bodies. Volunteers sat too, those who had followed Max, who had watched him stop in front of a rotten hatch in the woods, a place where forgotten souls had been buried without names. Victor Shaw sat across the room. Gray suit, gray tie, calm like a businessman facing a fraud lawsuit. But his eyes darted, avoiding contact, as if he knew another pair of eyes was in the room, eyes that had seen his shadow in the darkest chapters of the war. Max was led to a seat reserved beside Sarah and the attorney. No leash, no commands, and Max didn't need them. He chose his spot and lay down gently, front paws crossed, head lifted just enough. No barking, no whining, no motion, but in that stillness was a weight heavier than any argument echoing in the windless chamber. Then came the footage, from the stormy night, played by the prosecution. The room shifted as the dim light flickered, the wind howled through the mic, and Sarah's voice rang out through the rain, followed by the moment Max pushed Dusty from the wreckage, shielding her with a body of flesh and scars. A soft sob. Someone wiped their eyes, and when the screen went black, every gaze turned to Max. He didn't flinch, just the faintest tilt of the head, ears barely twitching. But his eyes, black, deep, and silent like a lake thawing after winter, were fixed straight on Victor Shaw. No one spoke. Only the wind slipped through the window cracks. Light from the high windows poured across the floor, stretching a gold streak toward where Max lay. In that light, he didn't move, not because he was frozen, but because nothing more needed to be said. His presence, scars on his leg, the indent around his neck, the gaze no longer filled with hatred but with understanding, was the clearest testimony of all. A soul once discarded had returned, not to take revenge, but to bear witness, not with a bark, but with a truth no one could deny. The judge, a war veteran who had lost comrades in Kandahar, looked at Max for a long time before bowing his head. He removed his glasses, stayed silent for a while, then said softly, "Today, a witness who cannot speak has made this entire courtroom listen." He nodded at Max, a gesture more solemn than any protocol, and at that moment Max turned to Sarah and gently touched her hand with his nose, as if to say, "We've said what we came to say." The verdict wasn't yet declared, but the public and conscience itself had already spoken. In a room where people debated facts, Max became the living proof of a truth that could never be erased, that loyalty should never be discarded, that even when trust is betrayed, it can rise again and lead justice forward in utter silence. After the trial, there were no medals, no rounds of applause. Sarah knew that, and Max, who had quietly learned through years of being forgotten, didn't need them. He didn't care about headlines or honors. The only thing Max noticed, after all of it, wasn't the noise out there. It was the silence just next door. Just a few meters from Sarah's house stood a small, cold, shadowed home. Its curtains always drawn, windows locked, yard overgrown with no sign of life. But to Max, that darkness wasn't unfamiliar. He sensed it, not with his eyes or nose, but with something deeper, a pain carved into bone. The man who lived there was Charlie, a veteran like Sarah, but whose heart hadn't made it back from the battlefield. They said Charlie suffered severe PTSD and had lived alone for nearly a decade. He feared loud sounds, avoided eye contact, and above all, hated dogs. Not from nature, but from something too deep, too personal. No one spoke of it aloud. People only knew that during a night watch in Anbar, Charlie had seen a friend blown up by a landmine, and the bark of a local dog just before the blast, since then, became death's voice in his memory. Charlie didn't go out, didn't take visitors. His lights flicked on only in strange hours, between midnight and dawn, as if he only existed while others slept. A man trapped, not in a trench, but in a memory only he could escape. After the trial, Max began sitting outside Charlie's fence, as if something in him knew. There is a soul here that hasn't been saved yet. The first day, Max did nothing. Just walked slowly to the dry patch beside the wooden fence and sat down, silent, facing the door. No barking, no scratching, no plea for attention, just waiting. Sarah didn't understand, but she didn't stop him. She had learned to trust Max, not like a pet, but like a soul who understood the silence of those who had walked through hell. The second day, Max came again. Same time, same place. By day 3, the wind picked up. Max sat slightly sideways, eyes narrowed, but didn't leave his spot. On day 5, the curtain shifted. A faint, pale eye peeked out from a narrow slit, then shut again. On day 8, an old chair appeared on the porch. No one sat in it, but no one removed it either. On day 12, a wooden bowl appeared near the fence, filled with water. Not much, but it was something. And on day 17, when Max arrived as always, the door slowly creaked open. Not wide, not fast, but enough for Charlie, thin, silver in his beard, hands lightly trembling, to step out onto the porch. He looked at Max for a long time, and Max, with all the patience in the world, didn't move forward, didn't reach, just tilted his head, eyes softening, as if to say, "I won't come in if you're not ready." Charlie pulled his hand from his coat pocket. His voice was hoarse like something dragged from a deep well. "Hello, soldier." Just one sentence, but like a door unlocked inside him. A door war, pain, and silence had sealed shut for years. From that day, a strange ritual took shape. No schedule, no invitation. Every morning Max showed up by the fence. Charlie waited on the porch. Sometimes they didn't speak. Sometimes Charlie told stories about Tom, the buddy who cracked jokes about his daughter while bullets hissed past, about the time he almost died mistaking a distant boom for artillery, about the flashlight that wouldn't switch on in the dark, and the last time he heard a dog howl before waking up alone. Max didn't reply, but he always listened, head raised, eyes fixed on Charlie, tail occasionally twitching like ripples on a thawing lake. One day Charlie paused mid-story when he reached the explosion. His hand gripped the chair's armrest. For the first time, Max stepped forward. Slowly, carefully, not touching, just sitting beside him, then resting his chin on Charlie's knee. Charlie didn't pull away. His eyes filled, but no tears fell. His chest heaved, like he had finally weathered a storm, not alone. Sarah saw it all from a distance. Once, she asked Charlie a single question. "What do you give Max that makes him wait here every day?" Charlie was quiet a long while, then answered, "I don't give him anything. He just came to take back what I'd lost." From a forgotten warrior, Max had become the silent flamekeeper for those afraid of the light. No words, no titles. He simply stayed, close enough for people to know they weren't abandoned. And for Charlie, a man who believed he had shattered forever in that night's blast, Max was the first response he had ever received, not in words, but in a presence that asked nothing. Some days seem ordinary, until a single moment bends the path of someone's life forever. And in that moment, a soul once drained of strength became a hero, not through brute force, but by instinct, and a heart that had once been betrayed. That morning, pale sunlight stretched across the rooftops of the quiet neighborhood. Sarah slipped on a light jacket and called Max into the car. He obediently hopped in, as always, no collar needed, no leash. They were heading to a nearby convenience store just to pick up a few dry goods and a can of food for Max. A short, peaceful errand. No one could have guessed that minutes later, that car would become the starting point of a life-altering act. When they arrived, Sarah turned off the engine and gently stroked Max's head. "Wait for me, okay? I won't be long." Max lay down, resting his head on the seat, eyes following her silhouette through the glass doors. The sounds inside were unremarkable at first. Shopping carts rolling, children laughing, soft music playing through the store speakers. But then, an outburst shattered the calm like a blade through silence. "Don't move! Shut up!" Max's ears shot up. A gasp followed. A high, thin, trembling child's voice. Then, silence. A silence too sharp to ignore. Max bolted upright. His eyes changed, no longer relaxed but alert, as if some dormant instinct, long asleep during his healing, had suddenly reawakened. Every muscle in his body tensed, breath quickened, but his focus stayed razor-sharp. From the back seat, he braced his front paws against the door. It wasn't locked. Sarah had forgotten. With a single push of his body, Max leaped from the vehicle, landing like a whisper on the pavement. No one called him. No one gave an order. But Max knew. Inside, the atmosphere had snapped taut. A man in a baseball cap, half his face obscured, held a handgun in one hand and a little girl in the other, about 7 years old, in a pink dress, hair tied unevenly. Her eyes were wide with terror, too afraid even to cry. One of his arms pinned her neck. The other shook as he aimed the gun at frozen employees. Max couldn't see everything, but he could smell fear. It was thick, bitter, mingled with sweat and cold metal, the scent of battle, of death hovering near. A smell no combat-trained dog ever forgets. He didn't bark. There was no growl, no reckless lunge. Max lowered his body, keeping close to the ground, quietly weaving through the low store shelves. His every move was guided not by training drills, but by memory forged in fire and trauma. He circled from behind, where the man's legs were exposed. Just a few more feet. Sarah, at the end of the aisle, had just spotted Max when she also saw the man tighten his grip on the girl's neck. The gun twitched. A finger trembled near the trigger. One wrong move and a life would be lost. Sarah screamed, but her voice drowned in the tension that filled the room like suffocating smoke. Then Max launched himself. A flawless leap, all strength in his hind legs like a bolt of lightning. He didn't go for the gun or the face. He went straight for the man's elbow. The impact was precise, strong enough to knock the weapon loose but not send the man crashing down, just enough to break control. The girl tumbled to the floor, crying aloud. Max immediately stood between her and the man, his back arched, head low, eyes locked on the threat. No growl, no advance, just stillness, like a living wall, a final shield. The man, now panicked, turned and ran. Store clerks surged forward, some restraining him, others calling the police. But all eyes remained fixed on Max, now gently licking the girl's forehead, tail wagging softly as if to say, "You're safe now. It's over." Later, when everything had settled, someone asked Sarah how Max reacted so quickly. She lowered her gaze, stroked his neck, and replied, "Because when a life needs saving, and no one else can, he will." The girl, still clinging to her mother, turned and looked at Max. She walked over, knelt, and wrapped her arms around his neck. Max blinked slowly, then sat calmly, as if nothing had happened. But in that embrace, the world became small and whole. A place where a once abandoned dog now stood as a guardian of peace. That evening, the news lit up. Every station replayed the footage. A nameless hero, with no stars on his shoulders, only scars on his body, had saved a child from the edge of death. They called him the Silent Warrior. But Sarah only smiled, ran her hand over Max's head, and whispered into his ear, "To me, you've never been silent. You're the echo of everything good that still lives in this world." By the next morning, Max's image had spread like wildfire across the country. The security footage, frame by frame of him diving through danger to save a little girl, played again and again on national TV. It became a living testament to loyalty, bravery, and a quiet gentleness no one expected from a scarred, four-legged soldier. Headlines filled the news: "The hero without a medal," "Max, the dog who saved a child in peacetime." A four-legged warrior raises the question, how do we treat our retired K9S? The government spoke. Veteran organizations held ceremonies of honor. A long-stalled national conference on post-service K9 care was finally revived. The world outside roared. Medals, speeches, thank yous, apologies, all came flooding toward the little home where Max now lived with Sarah. But, as always, Max didn't notice. And he didn't care. The next morning, with mist still clinging to the wooden fence, Max was already in his usual place, by Charlie's yard. No one called him. No one ordered him to go. It was a habit. But more than that, it was the choice of a heart unwilling to abandon those still battling shadows. Charlie sat on the porch again, placed his chair like always, sipping tea slowly, silently. But his gaze had softened. The lines around his eyes didn't seem as heavy. Sarah watched from inside. She didn't call Max in, didn't wave. She understood. Yesterday, Max had touched the heart of a nation, but today, his greatest act was still the smallest one. Just being there. Just breathing the same breath as those who thought they had nothing left to believe in. In the yard, Emma surrounded Max with stuffed animals, each tagged with handwritten notes. Brave dog, my hero, and best friend. Dusty, the pup Max had once saved in a storm, carried an old rag in her mouth, followed Emma's steps, and then curled up close to Max, breathing in the softest sleep she'd ever known. Sarah sat on the porch steps, a bundle of letters in her lap, more than 20 sent from different states, crayon scribbles from children, shaky handwriting from aging veterans. Thank you, Max, for reminding me why I once fought. I've never cried over a video until I saw that dog's eyes. My daughter was afraid of dogs. Yesterday she said, I think that dog would understand me. Sarah read each word. Every line felt like a breeze soothing old wounds. But when she turned to Max, he was still lying there, eyes half closed, head resting on Emma's leg. To him, those letters weren't accolades. They were echoes from a world he once thought had forgotten him. Now, that world was opening its doors again. Across military forums, old images of Max re-emerged, wearing armor, dashing through minefields, shielding squads under gunfire. quiet comments appeared beneath them. I remember that look. It always checked behind me before I left the bunker. I used to pat his head before every patrol. Seeing him again just makes me want to cry. And as the tide of love rose, when people flooded Sarah's home to see Max, she made a choice that surprised many. We will not accept media invitations. Max needs rest. He's fought long enough. A journalist asked, "But ma'am, Max is now a living symbol of this country. Don't you think he should inspire more people?" Sarah simply bowed her head, eyes falling on Max's silhouette stretching in the sunlight. Exactly because he's a living symbol, I want him to live. Not be chased, not be pressured, just to live, like a soul who finally deserves peace. That night, as the moon rose and the town fell into silence, Max remained on the porch, eyes open, watching the distance. In the darkness, wind brushed through the trees, and insects whispered their lullabies to restless dreams. But Max didn't sleep. He stayed like a night watchman for all the souls who once got lost. He needed no medals because his eyes, gentle, deep, unforgettable, were the only honor anyone ever needed to see. Amid the wave of praise and honors flooding in after Max saved the little girl at the convenience store, Sarah chose not to accept more interviews. She didn't step up to accept medals on Max's behalf. She quietly stepped back, not to avoid the spotlight, but to do something far more vital, to give life back to those souls who had once been forgotten, just as Max had been. The organization called Max's Second Chance was born on a quiet autumn afternoon, when falling leaves whispered of a truth. Some things that appear to be dying are simply preparing for a different kind of life. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, and no media coverage. Just a modest wooden house on the edge of town, a few humble kennels, and a stretch of land bathed in golden light. But it was there that the journey began for those once shattered, to stitch back together what had been broken, from wounds, from shadows, from nameless pain in both people and dogs. Dogs were brought in from abandoned shelters, dusty warehouses, from places once labeled retraining centers that were little more than burial grounds for dignity. Some had no teeth left. Some were missing ears or tails, their eyes clouded, their legs misshapen. No files, no names. To society, they were broken tools. But to Max, they were comrades, reflections of the journey he had survived. The first time a scorched-coat shepherd was brought in, it howled all night, thrashing when anyone came near. No one dared enter its kennel. Max, silent as ever, walked up. He didn't intrude, he didn't wag. He simply sat, just a few feet from the door, breathing slowly, eyes open. On the second night, the howls were shorter. By the third, they stopped. On the fourth, the dog stepped out and lay beside Max, like a shadow reclaiming its form. And it wasn't just dogs. Veterans with PTSD began to arrive. They were men and women who once held rifles, now clinging to pill bottles. Those who once wore medals, now hiding behind drawn curtains. They didn't come because they believed. They came because they had nowhere else to go, or someone had told them Max's story, and it kindled a faint hope. A soldier named Trevor, who lost his entire unit in a mine blast, was paired with Milo, a dog missing one eye. At first, Trevor couldn't even look at him. But when Max came over, licked Milo's shoulder, and then turned to meet Trevor's gaze, the man broke down. For the first time in 7 years, he cried, and didn't feel ashamed. Sarah never called it training. She said, "We're not teaching them how to live. We're helping them remember that they already did." Max no longer ran as fast. His hearing had dulled. But what he still carried was the most precious thing, his presence. Every time a new dog arrived, Max was the first to approach. Every time a veteran sat alone, Max lay nearby, never crowding, just breathing alongside them, like one heart beside another. No one could explain how the pairings of dogs and humans here worked so perfectly. But Sarah knew. It wasn't random. It was Max. He wasn't just the founding spirit. He was the heart that could sense loneliness others didn't see. In the backyard hung a hand-carved wooden sign. Second chance doesn't mean second best. It means you're still worthy of love. Beneath it was a picture of Max, not in his combat gear, not saving lives, but asleep with his head resting on a puppy's belly, ears drooped, breathing softly. A simple, quiet moment, yet exactly what this sanctuary hoped to offer. A place for those the world once rejected to just be. A reporter once asked Sarah, "Why name the center after Max, not yourself, the founder?" She smiled, looking towards the field where Max was walking slowly in the sunset, Dusty trailing behind him. "Because I'm just a survivor. But Max, he's the reason I survived." In the still evenings, as sunlight poured gold across the porch, Max would often sit at the open gate, eyes gazing into the distance. Some said he was waiting for another soul to find its way home. Others believed he was remembering the battlefield. But Sarah knew exactly what that look meant. "Here, you won't be left behind." Late that afternoon, as Max lay resting beneath the old oak tree behind the center, a pickup truck pulled up at the gate. The door opened, and out came a young Belgian Malinois, lean, scarred, eyes bloodshot like water stirred by fear. He was led on a short leash. His name was Duke, a strong name given by a rescue group. But the truth was, he had never lived like a real dog. From puppyhood, Duke had been trained through beatings, starvation, and forced submission in a sealed cage. People said he was untrainable, aggressive, and unsuitable for placement. One rescuer had even muttered, "This one will never be like Max." But when Max stepped forward, quietly, without warning, without judgment, no one dared say that again. Max didn't rush to greet him. He just approached gently, close enough for Duke to catch his scent. The smell of earth, of wind, and of an old dog who had endured similar fears. Duke didn't bark, didn't retreat. He stood there, trembling slightly, ears pinned back. But his eyes, though wary, didn't turn away. Sarah stood at a distance, not interfering. This was a moment only for Max and Duke. In the days that followed, no one instructed Duke to follow Max. But he did. He trailed a few steps behind. Not too close, but never letting Max out of sight. When Max lay down, Duke lay down too, just a few paces away. When Max rose to drink, Duke waited beside him. When Max walked past the empty kennels, Duke followed, as if trying to understand why the old dog wasn't afraid of the places where Duke had once been beaten and caged. No trainer taught Duke how to trust. Only Max, without saying a word, without teaching a thing. Simply by being. One morning, as soft rain fell, Sarah saw Max sitting near a patch of wildflowers, looking out toward the tree line. Duke stood nearby, body tense. But then something changed. Duke stepped forward, slowly, and sat down beside Max. No call, no treat, no clicker, just a quiet act. That, for Duke, meant everything. It was the first time he had ever sat next to another being without being forced to. From that day on, Max became his silent teacher. Duke began to learn, not through commands but through observation. He learned to lie still when people walked by. He learned not to growl when touched. He learned to stand patiently beside veterans who were still afraid of themselves. When Max walked slowly, due to age, Duke slowed his pace. When Max rolled over, basking belly up in the breeze, Duke learned to relax, something he had never dared before. Emma once called Max the gentle flame. If that's true, then Duke was the first spark, uncertain, flickering, but longing to burn. And Max was the one who lit him, not with grand gestures, but with a steady, quiet presence that let a young, broken soul believe, if he could survive and still be gentle, then maybe, so can I. One afternoon, Charlie sat reading on the porch. Duke walked up, closer than ever, then gently laid his head on Charlie's knee. Charlie startled, then looked toward Max, napping not far away, eyes half closed. Charlie smiled. He stroked Duke's head and said, "Well then, hello." top student of Professor Max. Max didn't react, but his tail thumped the ground once, just enough to say, "Message received." And so Max, once a tired warrior, became the quiet flame passing on life to the next generation. And Duke, the center's first student, stood as living proof that no soul is beyond healing, as long as someone is patient enough to simply be there. At first light, the sun's early rays slipped gently through the willow branches, casting soft ribbons of gold across the surface of the lake, like silk laid tenderly over still water. The morning air carried an unfamiliar stillness, not the emptiness of absence, but the hush of something sacred arriving. Beneath the willows, Max lay, his legs tucked in, his back slightly curved, his nose resting on the cool grass. Beside him was Duke, the once panicked, frightened young dog, now curled tightly beside him, as if standing guard over something holy. Max didn't move, didn't speak, but his eyes were slightly open, still observing, still present, just as he had always been, for every hurting soul that found its way to the sanctuary. Sarah approached slowly, carrying only one thing in her hands: Max's old collar. The leather had faded with time, and the metal tag was spotted with rust, but the name carved into it, Max, remained clear. A quiet reminder of a warrior who had never refused a mission, not even this last one, to leave in peace. She sat beside him, her hand gently running down the spine that had grown thin with age, feeling each breath grow slower, softer, but not painful. Max didn't respond beyond a glance, just enough to say, "I know you're here." Duke lifted his head as Sarah touched the collar. His eyes, still youthful, no longer held the confusion of his earliest days. He didn't step back. He didn't turn away. He simply watched, taking in this final lesson from his old teacher. Sarah unfastened Max's collar, not to close a chapter, but to pass it on. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them around Duke's neck, but her eyes were steady. "Not to replace," she whispered, "only to carry forward." Duke didn't flinch, didn't resist. He stood still, accepting it, not as an accessory, but as a quiet legacy. Max slowly closed his eyes. No whine, no strain. He let himself melt into the earth, not from weakness, but like an autumn leaf falling at its time, without regret, without resistance. The sun brushed across his faded fur, casting a soft halo around the body now becoming part of the stillness. Duke lowered his head, pressing his nose gently to Max's back. A final touch. No one had to teach him that. Max had taught it all, simply by being. Emma arrived, holding a worn-out teddy bear, the first gift she'd ever placed beside Max. She didn't cry. She knelt, set the bear beside him, and whispered, "I'll tell Dusty every day that you were here." Charlie stood a few steps away, eyes reddened, clutching an unfinished notebook. The old soldier didn't need to write anymore. The final lines had already been etched, not in ink, but in image. Sarah stood silently, her hand resting on Duke's shoulder. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Everything had been said by how Max had lived, quietly, steadfastly, and with a compassion deep enough to light the way for every lost soul. As the sun climbed higher and the breeze rustled through the lake and the willow trees, Duke turned and walked back toward the center. Slow, steady, his head held high. His eyes no longer looked like those of a dog once beaten. They held the gaze of someone entrusted with a mission. Watching him from afar, Sarah whispered, "He's gone, Max. But what you left behind will stay here, forever." As Duke left the lakeside, the morning light had already climbed above the wooden roof of the center. He didn't look back, not out of forgetting, but because Max no longer lay beneath the willow trees. Max had gone, but no one at the sanctuary ever spoke of him in the past tense. In the first days after that final morning, silence settled over the center like a soft cloth, not grief-stricken, not mournful, but reverent, a sacred pause for a great soul. No one sobbed aloud. Even Emma, the little girl who saw Max as her first friend who truly listened, simply sat on the porch steps, teddy bear in her lap, gazing at the sky. Sarah knew it wasn't that people weren't hurting. It was that no one truly believed Max had disappeared. He remained in every detail of life here. In each steady step Duke took, now wearing the collar engraved with his teacher's name. He wore it not as a symbol, but as a promise, to live by all that Max had taught, quietly, with conviction, and with deep compassion. Max lived on in Charlie's calm morning eyes, the once buried soldier who now walked every day beside Dusty, often pausing by the memorial plaque at the lakeside to murmur things only he and Max understood. Max was in the bright laughter of Emma as she ran among the puppies. Sometimes she'd stop, look toward the willow tree, and tilt her head slightly, as if waiting for someone to nod permission for her next adventure. For the newly rescued dogs, Max was the first gaze they met, framed in photographs throughout the center. Some trembled in corners, still carrying unhealed wounds from dark places, but slowly, they too made their way into the yard, step by step, where Duke and Max's other students waited. And somewhere, in the calm sunbathing of the pack, in the steady patience of Duke as he greeted another new arrival, Max was there again. In the main hallway of the sanctuary, Sarah had hung a single photo. No caption. A black and white picture of Max lying in the sunlight, his head resting on Sarah's feet, eyes half closed, back still straight. As if, even tired, he was still ready to guard. No words were needed. Anyone who walked past the image paused, some to say hello, others to give thanks, or simply to breathe deep and believe. There is still a soul watching over this place. One day, a young veteran, who had survived 3 suicide attempts, was paired with a Malinois named Ash. When he first entered the memorial room, he asked Sarah, "Why didn't you bury Max?" Sarah smiled. She pointed out the window, toward Emma placing a water bowl for Dusty, toward Duke lying beneath a tree beside a new arrival, toward Charlie quietly packing up toys into a basket. Because he didn't leave. He is this place. Time passed, and the center continued to welcome those in need of healing. Each soldier who arrived, each dog carried in, bore different cracks, no two alike. But they all heard about Max. Not through articles, not with grand words, just through whispered stories among volunteers, in grateful glances from those who'd been saved, in the quiet peace of a morning at the lakeside. Someone once said, "Some flames don't burn bright, they just stay warm enough to hold you through a lifetime." Max was that flame. In Sarah's notebook, tucked away in a drawer where she recorded every story of the sanctuary, the final page read, "Max, you didn't just save lives. You taught us how to love without holding on and how to wait without needing a reward. You are the fire behind every forgotten gaze, and you will never go out." And when the sun sets and the lake reflects a soft red glow, some say you might catch the faint outline of a figure under the willow. Not clear, not sharp, but impossibly warm. No one speaks. No one names it. But in their hearts, one message echoes. Gentle and eternal. We go on, Max, because of you. One late afternoon, as the golden sun slanted across the wooden porch and the scent of mint tea curled up from an old brown ceramic cup, Sarah opened the center's mailbox. Amid financial papers, registrations, and thank you cards, there was one simple envelope, handwritten in blue ink, the script a little shaky but clear. It read, "To Max, guardian of lost souls." She opened the letter right there, on the bench by the window, where Max used to rest in his final months. The white curtain fluttered gently, sunlight slanting through the wooden gaps, casting quiet streaks on the floor. "To the one who once lived like my son, and with even more courage." The first line made her heart tighten. "I'm the mother of Sergeant Luke Reynolds. In 2013, my son was trapped beneath rubble after an explosion. Only minutes of oxygen remained. No one dared go in, but a dog ran toward him, even though the bombs hadn't been cleared. That dog pulled my son out, its body bloodied and torn, but its eyes still clear. They said his name was Max." Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the letter, placing her other hand gently on the table. Luke lived, but he never spoke about that day. Not until last week, when he saw Max's face on the news. He cried. My son hasn't cried since leaving the service. All he said was, "Mom, I owe my life to someone who couldn't even speak." The letter continued, filling 2 full pages. It described how Luke left the army, lived quietly, and often dreamed of Max. In each dream, there was only a gaze, a light touch, a shadow that never left his side. The final line was brief, a plea or perhaps a final blessing. If Max is still alive, please let me thank him. If he's gone, please tell him I'll whisper his name in every prayer. Sarah didn't reply. She simply folded the letter neatly and placed it beside Max's old collar in the memorial room. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hill, she brought her tea to the porch, where Max used to lie and watch the sunset, and whispered, "You remember, don't you, Max? Kandahar, the blast. You chose to go back, even knowing you might not come out." She smiled, not from joy, but because something inside had softened. A breeze stirred, leaves rustled. She looked out into the open space, then instinctively lowered her gaze. A single yellow leaf had fallen at her feet. Beside it, a faint scratch on the wooden floor, like the mark of a paw. She didn't touch it. She just nodded. That night, Duke slept beneath the porch. In his dreams, he stood in a wide field. In the distance, a familiar silhouette, strong, calm, turned and looked back. No bark, no call, just eyes that glowed in the twilight. Duke didn't move, didn't follow, but he understood. Max hadn't left. He was in the spaces between unspoken gratitude and the souls still needing protection. The next morning, the sun rose slowly through a veil of thin mist. The air at the center felt sacred, like the whole place was holding its breath to honor something that couldn't be named. Beneath the willow where Max had lain one final time, a small group gathered. No ceremony, no speeches. Just Sarah, Emma, Charlie, Duke, and a few long-time volunteers. Each held a small, smooth stone, picked from different corners of the center, as if carrying a piece of the journey Max had left behind. Sarah stepped forward first, placing her stone on the weathered wooden platform. At its center stood a newly carved marker, rough and humble, bearing one handwritten inscription. Max, the heart that led us home. No one said a word, but when Duke stepped forward, a stone held gently in his mouth. Every gaze followed him, the young dog now wearing Max's old collar. He paused before the marker, placed the stone beside it, then sat quietly. No bark, no whimper, just bowed his head, as if listening to an echo from long ago, still warm in his chest. Sarah was still. In that moment, she saw everything Max had been, not just a service dog, not just a hero, but a bridge between pain and hope, between loss and the quiet miracles still possible. Max hadn't just led people home. He was home, with all the trust, safety, and warmth that word could ever hold. Charlie stepped forward, resting his weathered hand on Duke's head. He said nothing, just nodded, perhaps delivering a silent promise to Max he intended to keep. Emma, no longer the little girl who once told Max bedtime stories at the fence, had grown. But when she placed her stone, her eyes were the same, full of love. Then something small happened, but everyone felt it. A breeze passed gently through the garden. The willow leaves rustled in the morning light. A yellow leaf drifted down, spiraled, and landed atop the stone Duke had placed. He tilted his head, watching it for a long moment. Sarah stepped beside him, placing her hand on his back, and whispered, "That was him saying, 'Well done, Duke.'" From that day on, every soul welcomed into the center, human or dog, was led past the willow. They paused, bowed their heads before the simple wooden marker, and gently placed a stone of their own. Over time, A quiet circle formed around it. Not a grave, but a trail of hearts led home. Duke slowly became the center's quiet leader, not through growls or commands, but by simply being there. For every dog still shaking with fear, for every veteran haunted by silence, Duke stood steady. He didn't try to be Max, he didn't need to, because what Max left behind in Duke, and in all who remained, was something greater than legacy. He left the trust. And so Max's story didn't end. It began again, in the eyes of a dog stepping into the light for the first time, in the first laugh of a veteran who hadn't smiled in years, in the hesitant steps of a new arrival discovering that home wasn't a place on a map, but a feeling. Max was no longer just a name. Max was a flame, a breath, a heartbeat of forgiveness and courage, and in every moment, in this place where the lost found one another again, Max still leads the way. Some stories don't need loud voices or bright lights, just a glance, an old collar, or a quiet step through a rainy night. That's how Max lived, how he loved, and how he led so many back from the edge. From a forgotten dog beneath a sheet of rusted tin to the silent symbol of loyalty and healing. Max didn't just change one life. He opened hearts that once believed they could never trust again. If there's a Max in your life, a person, a dog, a moment that brought you back to yourself, what would you say to them today? Share it with us in the comments. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like it, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe for more stories like this. Because sometimes, what you need isn't an answer, but a loyal gaze still watching over you, quietly. Thank you for walking with Max. We'll see you in the next story.